A young man crossed the border for spring break and never came back. Weeks later, police would find his brain boiling in a pot on a ranch outside Matamoros, and that would turn out to be one of the milder details in tonight's episode. Before we go there, if this channel keeps you company on your late-night scroll, hit subscribe and tap that like button. It genuinely helps us keep telling these stories the way they deserve to be told. Now let's begin. Crimes against human life are always terrible, but some cases go beyond understanding, where the cruelty crosses every line we thought existed. Tonight, we're covering some of the most shocking crimes ever committed, cases where the perpetrators showed a level of brutality that feels pulled from a nightmare. These crimes didn't just end lives. They left scars on entire communities, scars that never fully closed. Tonight, we dig into the details of these extreme cases, what drove these people to commit such atrocities, and the devastating aftermath they left behind. In the late 1980s, Nathan Pierce was a 21-year-old college student with big plans for his future. Like a lot of guys his age, he dreamed big, but he also knew the value of letting loose once in a while. Back then, plenty of destinations called out to young Americans looking for a break. But for college kids from Texas, the border towns of Mexico held a special kind of pull. The promise of parties without limits drew students from every direction, turning the region into a buzzing, restless meeting point. Eager for a break from exams and responsibilities, Nathan decided to take one of those trips with his friends. What was supposed to be a few days of rest and fun would turn into a nightmare Nathan Pierce would never walk away from. It started on March 10th, 1989, when a young man named Gregory Hale left his university and drove toward Austin, Texas, to meet up with his childhood friend and med student, Nathan Pierce. Once together, the two drove on to Santa Fe to pick up two more friends, William Carter and Trevor Adams. Spring break had arrived, and the plan was simple: cross into Mexico and spend it together. After a 9-hour drive, the group arrived at South Padre Island and checked into a beachfront hotel. In those years, South Padre was one of the top spots for American college students, largely because of how close it sat to the Mexican border. On their first night, Nathan and his friends partied until sunrise, then spent the next day at the beach. That's when the group decided they'd cross into Mexico together with another group of students they'd met on the island, a group made up almost entirely of young women. Following the usual routine of meals and plans, they drove to the U.S.-Mexico border, parked, and crossed on foot. Nathan walked alongside his friends and the group of women, all of them heading to a club called Sergeant Pepper's in Matamoros. The first night in Mexico went smoothly, and the group eventually made their way back to the hotel. But the next morning, they crossed the border again on foot, this time finding an even bigger crowd of tourists than the day before. Nathan and his friends bar-hopped through the night, stopping at several spots, including the London pub. Around 2 a.m., the group decided to head back to the hotel, but the crowd was so thick that they lost sight of each other. At first, it seemed Nathan had made it to the border with his friend William, but before crossing, William ducked into an alley to relieve himself. When he came back, Nathan was gone. "Where'd he go?" William asked, scanning the crowd. He told the others, and the group stayed near the border on the Mexican side, searching for a while longer. Eventually, they crossed back into the U.S. and decided to wait by their car, sure Nathan would show up any minute. He never did. The group told themselves he'd probably gotten separated and gone back with another group of American students, so they returned to the hotel to wait it out. But the next morning, with no sign of Nathan anywhere, they went to the authorities and reported him missing. At first, the police didn't take it too seriously. Disappearances like this were common among groups of friends partying near the border. Usually the missing person turned up hungover, with new friends, or sleeping it off in some alley. By that point, American and Mexican border police had already logged around 60 similar disappearances that season, most of which resolved themselves within a day or two. But as the days dragged on with no word from Nathan, The case started drawing real attention from both Mexican and American authorities. His friends walked investigators through every step of that last night, retracing his path. With no leads turning up, Mexican police began to suspect something darker, that he might have been the victim of a crime. Homicides in the area were common enough that, even though Nathan was technically still just missing, helicopter searches for his body were launched around Matamoros almost immediately. Nathan's parents met with Texas state officials, senators among them, desperate for answers. That pressure got thousands of flyers with his photo distributed across every border town in the area. The real break came on April 1st, when a truck blew through a Mexican federal checkpoint without stopping, kicking off an unofficial pursuit. Federal agents chose to trail the vehicle quietly, in an unmarked car, without the driver noticing. The truck led them to a ranch outside Matamoros. Believing it was loaded with drugs, the agents settled in to watch from a distance. What they'd eventually find at that ranch had nothing to do with drugs. After about 30 minutes, the truck left the property and drove toward town. With the ranch apparently empty, the agents moved in and searched the grounds. It didn't take long to find drug paraphernalia and something else. Signs of what looked like some kind of occult ritual gathering. Not entirely sure what they'd stumbled onto. Investigators identified the truck's driver as a man named Marcus Reyna. They began digging into his family and the drug network he seemed connected to around Matamoros. About 8 days later, Marcus, his uncle, and several other members of what turned out to be a cult were arrested. Among them was the ranch's caretaker, who told police the property regularly received tourist visitors. When shown a photo of Nathan Pierce, he confirmed the young man had been there. Marcus was interrogated hard, pressed for Nathan's whereabouts. Eventually, he admitted the young American had been killed, just like several other men who'd been murdered in the region over the past 9 months. According to Marcus, the cult's leader, a man calling himself Father Alexander, had ordered the group to find a white man for a sacrifice. In the leader's twisted belief system, sacrificing a man with those specific traits granted the cult supernatural protection, strength, prosperity, and immunity from the law. He told us it had to be him, Marcus said, a white man. For the ritual, investigators went back to the ranch and began searching for bodies. Before long, they found Nathan Pierce, but disturbingly, his legs were missing. Members of the cult explained, almost matter-of-factly, that they routinely removed the legs of their victims to make burial easier. Later, around 14 mutilated bodies were recovered from the property, but all of them belonged to young men from rival drug groups. Nathan Pierce was the only one identified as an American tourist, kidnapped and murdered. From the ranch, investigators also seized 11 vehicles, a large quantity of drugs, weapons, and in what would become the case's most horrifying discovery, an iron pot containing traces of human brain matter, later confirmed to belong to Nathan Pierce himself. In his statement, Marcus Reyna walked investigators through exactly how the American had been taken back in March. He said Nathan had been lured close to his truck, where another cult member appeared to help restrain him. Inside the vehicle, both men had to fight hard to subdue him. A short distance later, they stopped to catch their breath, and Nathan took the opportunity to run. He was recaptured by other cult members not long after. He was taken to the ranch, fed, and about 12 hours after the abduction, brought to a small cabin on the Swells property. There, the cult's leader, Father Alexander, spent time alone with him, torturing and sexually assaulting Nathan over the following hours. Sometime later, still alive, Nathan was taken out to a field and killed with a machete blow to the back of the neck, decapitating him. His brain was boiled in a metal pot. His legs were cut off at the knee, and a wire was threaded through his spine, so that once buried, his bones could later be dug up easily. The group kept bones from their victims as necklaces. By this point, several cult members had already been captured, all except the leader himself, Father Alexander, now the target of a joint manhunt by Mexican and American authorities. To provoke him into making a mistake, Mexican police burned down the cabin on the ranch he was known to be emotionally attached to, the site of his main rituals. The fire was broadcast on national television, meant to destabilize him enough to force an error while on the run. It worked. On May 6, 1989, Father Alexander and the remaining cult members were tracked down to an apartment. The building was surrounded and a firefight broke out. Father Alexander hadn't expected to be found and had little ammunition left. The standoff lasted around 45 minutes before he ordered one of his followers, a man known as De Leon, to shoot him and his most loyal follower, a woman named Elena Vidal. De Leon later admitted he'd hesitated at first, until Father Alexander told him if he didn't do it, he'd suffer in hell forever. So De Leon shot them both, side by side, in a closet inside the apartment. The rest of the group surrendered immediately after. Everyone involved in the killings was eventually convicted in Mexican courts, receiving sentences ranging from 30 to 60 years. This case is remembered not just as one of the cruelest crimes of its era, but as a chapter in the broader satanic panic debate sweeping the United States at the time. A debate that, in this particular corner of the world, turned out to be far more real than anyone wanted to believe. Every mother has instincts, especially when it comes to her own children. That's exactly what Margaret Ellison felt the moment she looked into the eyes of the man who would go on to murder her daughter. She would later say that the hair on the back of her neck stood up the instant she saw him, as if every part of her recognized the danger he carried. It happened the day she arrived at her old house in Hattersley, England, and found her daughter, Kelly Ann, standing in the kitchen beside her boyfriend. Margaret had no idea her teenage daughter had been seeing a man far older than her. And although the two of them tried to hide the age gap, it was obvious the man, James Whitmore, was well into his 40s. It was the first time Margaret had ever laid eyes on him, but something inside her screamed that this man was dangerous. Still, as unsettling as his presence felt, there was nothing she could do about it. According to Kelly, the two had met years earlier, when she was just 14 and working as a babysitter. She'd kept the relationship secret until that day, when she finally told her parents about James. And according to Kelly, even if her parents disapproved, nothing was going to keep her and James apart. That warning became reality in November 1995, when Kelly decided to move out and live with him. Faced with the situation, her parents asked her to at least visit often, something Kelly agreed to. But in the months that followed, she simply vanished from their lives. Before all this, Kelly had been known as a lively, sociable young woman, always out and about, seen everywhere around town. Once she moved in with James, she disappeared from public view almost entirely. On one of her rare visits home, her parents noticed bruises on her arm. She blamed it on a household accident. That was how things stayed until April 16, 1996, when the worst news of the Ellison family's life arrived at their door. Police showed up and explained that James had walked into the police station that day of his own accord and confessed to accidentally killing Kelly Ann. According to him, the two had argued while she was in the bath. During what he described as some kind of breakdown, he'd held her under the water, and she'd accidentally drowned. At first, the story sounded strange enough on its own, but when police reached the couple's apartment, what they found was far more disturbing. Blood trailed through the entire apartment, all the way to the bathroom. Pools of blood sat in multiple different rooms, suggesting Kelly had been beaten long before she was ever brought to the bathtub. When they found her body, 17-year-old Kelly was indeed drowned in the bathtub. But examining her more closely, officers realized her eye sockets were completely empty. Kelly's eyes had been gouged out. Her body also showed extensive burns and numerous mutilations. James was arrested immediately on suspicion of murder, and her body was sent for forensic examination. Home Office pathologist Dr. William Ashford would later report that across his entire career, he'd examined nearly 600 homicide victims and had never once seen injuries as horrific as Kelly Ann's. He counted roughly 150 separate wounds, inflicted over a period of at least a month. Some injuries showed she'd been bound by her hair, burned with a hot iron, repeatedly, strangled, and stabbed. The mutilations covered her legs, her torso, and even the inside of her mouth. Given the range of injuries, the pathologist believed the weapons used likely included knives, forks, and even a pair of garden shears. When he first saw the empty eye sockets, he assumed the injury had happened shortly before her death. But closer examination revealed her eyes had actually been removed roughly 5 days before she finally drowned, pointing to a crime involving prolonged torture, aggravated assault, and eventual murder. He also noted the empty sockets themselves had been stabbed multiple times over those 5 days. When confronted, James didn't deny the accusations, but he pleaded not guilty, insisting the blame lay with Kelly herself. Investigators, unsurprisingly, dismissed the claim outright, and the case went to trial. At trial, prosecutors laid out the full scope of the torture, which they argued had caused Kelly immense physical and psychological suffering. The anguish she endured before her death had almost certainly pushed her into a state of mental collapse, where she could no longer fully process what was happening to her. Strikingly, the prosecution brought forward several other women who confirmed they too had been abused by James during past relationships. In 1970, he'd married for the first time, a marriage that ended because of his controlling behavior. Later, he began a relationship with Rachel Doyle, who was 20 at the time. Before the jury, she testified that over their 2 years together, he'd used her as a punching bag. The abuse started infrequently, but became daily. It reached its peak when James tried to drown her during a bath, exactly what he'd later do to Kellyanne. Terrified, Rachel ended the relationship and fled. After her, James began seeing 15-year-old Emma Wallace. Rachel told the jury that relationship was short-lived too, ending after he tried to drown Emma as well, this time in the kitchen sink. Sometime later, he met Kellyanne, manipulating her from adolescence all the way through to the day they moved in together. In his own defense, James claimed Kelly had provoked him to the point where he was forced to kill her, insisting she had made his life a living hell. The jury found the claim baseless and utterly unconvincing, nothing close to justifying that level of cruelty. In 1997, 49-year-old James Whitmore was found guilty of murdering Kelly Ann Ellison. He received a life sentence, with a minimum of 20 years before parole eligibility. The judge told the court that James was a dangerous, manipulative man, an abuser of women, who would likely go on to abuse others if ever released. After the trial, the court offered psychological counseling to the jurors, who'd had to sit through photographs of Kelly's extreme injuries. Every one of them accepted. In the years that followed, Margaret Ellison carried a heavy guilt for not listening to her instincts the day she met James. Every day, she replayed what she might have done differently to protect her daughter. But over time, she came to understand that guilt would never bring Kelly back. As painful as it was, she knew she had to find a way to forgive herself and keep living. It was a quiet morning when Mary Holloway greeted a charming man at the entrance of Mount Vernon Elementary School in Los Angeles. He seemed perfectly ordinary, confident, polite, easy to trust. He explained he'd been sent to pick up the daughter of his co-worker, Charles Parker, who'd apparently been in an accident. Mary, suspecting nothing, looked him over. He seemed completely harmless, and believing his story, brought out 12-year-old Marion Parker to go with him. Mary could never have known that decision would become the worst mistake of her life, setting off one of the most horrifying crimes in 1920s Los Angeles history. A day after Marion's apparent kidnapping, her family began receiving telegrams and letters demanding $1,500, nearly $24,000 today. Each letter was signed with a different pseudonym: Death, Fate, Fox. The sender warned the Parker family not to try anything clever, insisting Marion was safe, but that any interference with his plans would put her life at risk. Still, in one of his final letters, he wrote that no one would ever see the girl again, except the angels in heaven. That particular letter was signed Fate, with the word Death written in Greek at the top. Before that letter even arrived, a ransom exchange was arranged for December 16, 1927. Before meeting the kidnapper, Marion's father Charles recorded the serial number on every bill, hoping they could later be traced back to the criminal. But the exchange never happened. The kidnapper apparently spotted police trailing Charles from a distance and never showed, leaving him waiting for hours for nothing. The next day, new letters arrived. One was written by Marianne herself. Another warned she would only survive until December 17th, when a new, unwatched exchange had to take place. Desperate, Charles begged authorities to let him meet the kidnapper completely alone. 2 more telegrams followed, the kidnapper making clear he was prepared to kill Marion if his demands weren't met exactly. On the night of December 17th, phone call after phone call went back and forth with the kidnapper, arranging a handoff. The agreed meeting point was a street corner in downtown Los Angeles. When Charles arrived, the kidnapper pulled up beside him and stopped, holding a sawed-off shotgun on him through the car window. His face was hidden behind a bandana. As Charles reached for the money, he caught a glimpse of Marion sitting in the passenger seat, bundled under layers of clothing. Her eyes were open, but she didn't respond when he called her name. At first, he assumed she'd been drugged. Once the money changed hands, the kidnapper threw his Chrysler coupe into gear and shoved open the passenger door, pushing Marianne out as he pulled away. She fell lifeless into the street, and it was only when Charles rushed to her that he realized her arms and legs were gone. Her eyes were open, but not by her own will. They'd been sewn shut with piano wire. The autopsy later revealed Marion had also been disemboweled, her lower torso stuffed with a towel and a man's shirt, items that likely belonged to her killer, pushed inside to keep her organs from spilling out. The medical examiner determined she'd already been dead for at least 12 hours, meaning she was murdered right around the time Charles had been spotted approaching with police at the first failed meeting point. The entire city of Los Angeles was stunned. That night, investigators and officers mobilized an enormous manhunt for whoever was responsible for the atrocity. By the next morning, a resident of Elysian Park discovered Marion's severed arms and legs, dumped in the street and wrapped in newspaper. In total, around 20,000 police officers and volunteers joined the search. A $50,000 reward went up for the killer's identity, eventually climbing to $100,000, dead or alive. 2 days later, the getaway car was located and traced back as stolen from San Diego. Fingerprints recovered from it were sent for lab analysis. While waiting on the results, the towel found inside Marion's torso led investigators to an apartment complex. They interviewed the tenants there but came up empty until the fingerprint results came back, matching a man with a criminal record, William Hartley, a former co-worker of Marion's father. The two had worked together at the First National Bank of Los Angeles, where Charles was a teller's assistant and William an officer. When Charles learned this, he remembered that the previous year, William had been arrested after Charles reported him for stolen and forged checks. William had served time and was later released on parole. Following this lead, investigators confirmed William really was living in that same apartment complex, under the name Donald Evans. His apartment was searched, and they found bloody footprints and items linked to the crime, along with newspaper clippings about the kidnapping and remnants of burned letters. An intense manhunt followed until they finally tracked him fleeing toward Oregon. Newspapers spread William's identity everywhere, and he was soon recognized by a gas station attendant who described him wearing a dark blue suit and expensive shoes. Police eventually traced him to Seattle, Washington, but William wasn't captured until a string of sightings and tips led officers to Echo, Oregon, where a lengthy car chase finally ended with his arrest. When he was taken into custody, William loudly claimed a demon had killed Marion Parker and that he'd committed the crime to pay for his college tuition. Before trial, he tried pinning the kidnapping on 2 other men, both of whom turned out to already be in custody for unrelated crimes. Investigators discovered he'd met them through a mutual friend. William was ultimately charged as the sole perpetrator of Marion Parker's kidnapping and murder. Though he initially claimed innocence, he eventually confessed. According to his own account, after the failed negotiation, He'd taken Marion back to his apartment, tied her to a chair, and blindfolded her. He then strangled her until she lost consciousness, hung her body upside down over his bathtub, and cut her throat to drain the blood. During the dismemberment, William claimed her body convulsed and flew out of the tub, suggesting she may still have been alive during part of the process. He wrapped the remains in newspaper afterward and stored the torso in a suitcase. He said he went to see a movie that night but couldn't focus and cried the entire time. Overnight, he realized Charles might want to see Marion before handing over the money. So he took the torso back out of the suitcase, dressed it in layers of clothing, stuffed the interior with a towel and shirt, applied makeup to the face, and sewed the eyes shut with piano wire. At trial, his lawyer entered an insanity defense. But a court psychologist testified that William's mind was clear. His confession was coherent, consistent, and he never once lost track of the details of what he'd done. Prosecutors also argued William had acted out of revenge against Charles for reporting him for bank fraud. They pointed to an interview in which William reportedly told a reporter that his crime would bring him just as much notoriety as the murder committed by Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb 3 years earlier, also in Los Angeles. The jury rejected the insanity defense, and William Hartley was convicted of Marion Parker's murder. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The following October, he was executed at San Quentin State Prison, and a grim footnote to the case. When the trapdoor opened beneath him, his neck failed to break. He struggled violently for 2 full minutes before finally dying of asphyxiation. The brutal murder of young Marion shocked the society of its time, introducing a level of bestial cruelty that would only grow more common on American soil in the decades to follow. The summer of 1991 was quiet in the home of the Wallace family. Tucked into an upscale neighborhood in Southern California, Richard and Sandra Wallace took enormous pride in their daughter, Diane Wallace, just past 20 years old. Neither of them could have predicted the horror that was about to enter their lives. The quiet broke one morning when the couple woke up to find Diane's bed empty, with no sign of her anywhere. That was the start of an agonizing disappearance that would stretch on for years before the truth finally surfaced. But first, who was Diane Wallace? 23 years old. She'd recently graduated with a degree in social sciences from the University of California and was living a peaceful life with her family in Irvine. To help pay for school, she'd taken a waitressing job at a local restaurant. According to her family, she was enjoying her youth in the area, waiting for the right financial footing to look for something more permanent. On the night of June 7, 1991, Diane told her parents she was heading out to a concert with a coworker named Robert. Normally, when she didn't come home after a night out, her parents assumed she'd crashed at her other close friend's place, a coworker named Amy. So when they noticed she wasn't home the next morning, they called Amy right away. Amy hadn't seen her. In fact, she hadn't heard from Diane at all, which struck even Amy as strange. Worried now, Diane's parents started calling everyone they could think of, hoping for any lead. They reached Robert, the friend she'd gone to the concert with. He told them that after the show, Diane had driven him home and left. She hadn't mentioned stopping anywhere or going anywhere, but straight back. Word of the disappearance spread through Diane's circle of friends, and they began searching on their own. A longtime friend named Deborah retraced the entire route Diane would have driven that night, from the venue to Robert's place and back toward her own home. Along an isolated stretch of alternate highway, Deborah found Diane's car. She searched the vehicle thoroughly, but found no sign of where Diane might have gone. By then, the Irvine Police Department was aware of the disappearance and had begun their own investigation. Examining the car, they noticed one of the tires was flat. Strangely, a pair of pantyhose lay discarded on the front seat. Diane's purse and car keys were both missing. Investigators theorized Diane had likely pulled over to deal with a flat tire when an opportunistic predator happened upon her. They began looking into every close friend and romantic interest in her life, hoping she might have reached out to one of them for help. But everyone they spoke to, friends, co-workers, clearly adored her. Robert questioned extensively, confirmed the concert and the drink they'd had afterward at a local bar. Around 2 a.m., she dropped him at his place and headed home. Though suspicion lingered on him for a while, he was eventually cleared, passing a polygraph along with several other people connected to the case, none of whom showed signs of deception. Helicopters swept the desert terrain surrounding where the car had been found, searching for any trace of Diane. Nothing turned up. A K-9 unit was brought in and managed to track her scent roughly 250 feet before it vanished entirely. To investigators, it seemed clear. Someone had stopped, offered help, and abducted her in the process. But beyond that, there was nothing. 1991 turned into a nightmare for the Wallace family as the case went cold for lack of leads. In response, local newspapers and TV stations picked up the story, hoping someone had seen or heard something. Nothing came of it. Investigators, when pressed, avoided saying what they truly believed. But privately, they feared the worst. Over the following months, Irvine police received a steady trickle of anonymous tips, each one investigated, each one leading nowhere. By that point, it was becoming clear this case might join the ranks of the terrible, unsolved cold cases that never get answers. Diane's parents spent years chasing every lead they could find, living with the agony of not knowing what had happened to their daughter. That anguish stretched on for nearly 3 years, until a grim discovery finally broke the silence. In the mid-1990s, a retired couple, Harold and Ruth Ashby, settled in Prescott Valley, Arizona, where they began selling goods at the local swap meet. In July 1994, they met a newcomer to the market who introduced himself as John, claiming he'd moved to the area about 6 months earlier. After chatting for a while, John invited them to his home to look at more items he had for sale. When they arrived, they noticed a large moving truck parked in his yard. Oddly, the vehicle looked abandoned. Weeds had grown up thick around the tires, suggesting it hadn't moved in a long time. After finishing their business, Harold and Ruth talked it over and started to wonder if the truck might be stolen. Concerned, they wrote down the plate number and passed it along to a police officer who regularly shopped at the swap meet. He took the tips seriously and discovered the truck had indeed been reported stolen 6 months earlier. The officer drove out to John's property himself. No one was home, so he began looking around, particularly at the truck, which was surrounded by chemical containers and strange extension cords running from its rear. It looked, to the officer, like it might be some kind of makeshift drug lab. He passed his concerns to the narcotics unit, who obtained a search warrant. Among those who arrived to search the truck was Yavapai County Sheriff Daniel Masher. When they opened the back of the truck, there was no lab in sight, but they were hit by an overpowering odor coming from a freezer inside. It didn't smell like decomposition, so the officers initially assumed drugs. When they opened the freezer, they found several plastic bags, and at the bottom, a larger one. Inside it was a human arm. As the sheriff kept opening the bag, he realized he was looking at the body of a young adult woman, kneeling, head down, wrists cuffed behind her back. A cloth had been stuffed in her mouth and sealed shut with tape. The scene was devastating for the officers on site, and it only grew stranger when the property's owner approached them. Calm, almost indifferent, as if he had no idea there was a body in his freezer. The sheriff arrested him on the spot and brought him in. At the station, the man identified himself as Peter Aldous Kraft, in his 40s. He remained calm and cooperative as he talked about his life in the area. But the moment investigators brought up the body in the freezer, he shut down completely and asked for a lawyer. Through forensic examination and the victim's physical characteristics, the woman was identified as Diane Wallace, missing since 1991. Peter, though, refused to say another word about it. Investigators tore his property apart. What they found was disturbing on every level. Weapons scattered throughout the house, and in the basement, a hammer stained with dried blood. Women's clothing turned up alongside a collection of purses and Social Security cards. The sheer number of items convinced investigators they might be dealing with a serial killer. Later, in the depths of the basement, they discovered what looked like an underground room, still under construction. The theory that more bodies might be buried there sent a chill through the investigation. But when cadaver dogs were brought in, they found nothing. Further, still, investigators suspected Diane hadn't been Peter's only victim, and they moved quickly to distribute his identity to agencies across the region. Before long, several women came forward, positively identifying Peter as their attacker. One described being driven out into the desert and surviving an attempted strangulation, escaping naked into the desert and running until she found help and called police. Others came forward with similar stories, describing sexual assault and being handcuffed to beds without consent, along with other disturbing encounters with him. Among the women's belongings recovered from the house, Diane's purse turned up, containing her personal documents. The outfit she'd been wearing the night she disappeared was also eventually found, alongside a collection of newspaper clippings he'd kept about her case. Peter was charged with murder, but pleaded not guilty, and the case moved toward trial. In court, prosecutors laid out the medical examiner's findings. Diane had been sexually assaulted, and the cause of death was ruled as blunt force trauma to the head, 30 separate blows, likely from the hammer found in his home. Prosecutors also revealed that in 1991, Peter had owned a paint company with a warehouse in Orange County, located just off the highway where Diane's car had been found. After his arrest, that warehouse, still legally his, was searched. Investigators found a hidden basement area where luminol testing revealed traces of human blood. Lab results confirmed the blood belonged to both Peter and Diane, suggesting she'd fought violently for her life against her attacker. With Peter offering nothing, prosecutors theorized that in 1991, he'd been hunting for potential victims when he came across Diane on the roadside, struggling with her flat tire. He likely approached under the guise of helping her, then struck her in the head with a hammer at some point, dragging her body roughly 230 feet to his vehicle, cuffing her, and taking her to the warehouse, where she was assaulted and killed. Prosecutors argued that the underground room found at Peter's home was recently built, evidence that, all those years later, he'd finally been working out a way to dispose of her body so it would never be found. In other words, he'd been planning to bury her, along with every incriminating item connected to her, right there at his home. It painted the picture of a patient, careful criminal who knew exactly what he was doing. In the end, Peter Eldis Kraft was found guilty of kidnapping and murdering Diane Wallace. He was sentenced to death. Now 74, he remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison in California. The Wallace family said justice had finally been served, and that they could rest knowing the man responsible was behind bars, off the streets for good. Even today, Elsa Bergqvist and her husband, well into their later years, avoid the midsummer solstice celebrations that light up Sweden every year. While their neighbors celebrate, they choose instead to visit the cemetery, where parts of their brutally murdered daughter's body are buried. Elsa still remembers her daughter Marika's smile vividly, the warmth, the energy she carried into every room. But she knows she'll never see or hear her daughter again in this life. The memory that stays with her most is the last thing Marika ever said to her. "I hope I'm doing the right thing." That sentence has never left her mind, tangled up with a mystery that still haunts her to this day. This story begins when 20-year-old Marika Bergqvist, a young Swedish woman, won a prize with a substantial cash reward. When she received it, she told her family exactly what she planned to do with it. Like many of her friends, Marika had always dreamed of traveling, of moving to the United States. Sweden itself often encouraged this, with agencies set up specifically to place young Swedes in jobs across different parts of the country. Through one of those agencies, Marika landed a job in Dover, Massachusetts, working as a nanny for photographer Edmund Rowe and his wife, the artist Vivian Castle. Once she arrived in the U.S., Marika adjusted quickly to American life, helped along by how much the children she cared for adored her. And though she was in a foreign country, she stayed close with a network of other young Swedes scattered around the Boston area, living lives much like her own. Marika and her friends often went out together, drinking and dancing on their nights off. Everyone who knew her described her as adventurous, fun, and outgoing. In her early letters home, Marika wrote enthusiastically about her new life. But then, unexpectedly, something shifted. Her later letters carried a heavier tone. She began writing that life in America wasn't what she'd expected. In one letter to a friend back home, Ulrika Nilsson, Marika wrote that something terrible had happened and that she'd explain everything in person once she got home. Reading between the lines, it was clear Marika had already started planning her return to Sweden. But the night of Friday, June 21st, 1996, would change everything. That evening, Marika and her friends got ready to head into Boston to celebrate the summer solstice. As the night stretched on, their final stop was a club called Club Zanzibar. Everyone drank heavily, but Marika, more than the rest, ended up especially intoxicated. As the hours passed, her friends drifted home one by one until she was the only one left, eventually asked to leave the club because of how drunk she'd become. Witnesses said she left calmly, without resistance, on her own. Around 3:20 in the morning, a homeless man walking near the club spotted her dancing and singing to herself, alone, in an alley. The last confirmed sightings of her were on Tremont Street and the well-known Boylston Place. 2 days later, on the morning of Sunday, June 23rd, a homeless man was walking through Boston's Back Bay neighborhood when he came across a large metal dumpster. He stopped to dig through the trash piled inside and found a heavy, dark green garbage bag, far heavier than it should have been. Still standing in the dumpster, he tore open part of the bag, and what he found sent him running through the street, screaming for help. It was the beginning of a case that would shake Boston to its core through the rest of the decade. The first officer to arrive at this dumpster was Detective Frank Coyle of the Boston Police Department. Looking into the bag, he could make out part of a human arm. Along with it, officers would find the remains of a woman's severed torso and a second arm. Police sealed off the area and searched the dumpster thoroughly, hoping to find the rest of the body, but came up empty. Though the body had been dismembered, the head remained attached to the torso, allowing investigators to clearly see ligature marks from strangulation around the neck. Once the remains were sent for autopsy, the medical examiner confirmed strangulation as the cause of death. The killer hadn't used a knife for the dismemberment, but rather an electric saw, which had made the process far quicker and cleaner. The victim was soon identified as Marika Bergqvist. The news sent shockwaves through both Boston and Sweden, kicking off an intense manhunt for whoever was responsible. The cruel, almost callous way the killer had discarded her body, treated like garbage, left local residents deeply shaken, fearful for their own safety. Boston police launched a citywide operation, searching every dumpster they could find, hoping to locate the lower half of her body. Nothing turned up. The first real leads came from partial fingerprints recovered on the bags, but they never led to a suspect. Alongside that, investigators discovered Marika had secretly been seeing a Boston police officer, unknown to her family. He was questioned by his own colleagues and ultimately cleared. The search for the rest of her remains continued for days, aided by police cadaver dogs, but no new leads emerged. It wasn't until several months later that a resident of Marshall, Virginia, nearly 500 miles from Boston, contacted authorities after finding a pair of severed female legs. When Marshall authorities examined the remains, they reached out to Boston police, describing legs belonging to a woman somewhere between 20 and 40 years old. But the legs weren't Marika's, leading investigators to believe her killer had either disposed of her legs somewhere far harder to find, or had kept them himself as some kind of trophy. As the case gained national attention, Boston police intensified the investigation to the point of bringing in the FBI to help track down the killer. Once briefed on the details, agents from the Behavioral Sciences Unit theorized that the speed and efficiency with which the killer had disposed of the remains suggested Someone experienced, potentially a skilled, prolific serial killer. The disposal method and how cleanly he'd vanished without a trace supported that theory. What's more, no one had reported hearing a neighbor running an electric saw or anything like it, which meant the killer likely had access to a private, secure location for the dismemberment. Forensic psychologists, however, viewed the case differently. Marika's body showed no additional mutilation, the kind typically seen in serial offender cases, and the dismemberment itself may have simply been a way to dispose of the body and hide evidence of sexual assault. From the psychologist's perspective, the killer was more likely someone inexperienced, young, and potentially capable of committing a similar crime again soon. Working from both theories, Boston police questioned and investigated more than 300 people. That search for answers eventually turned suspicion toward Marika's employer, photographer Edmund Rowe. Several former employees and nannies described inappropriate behavior from him to investigators. Police also discovered that the day after Marika's disappearance, Edmund had obtained special permission from Dover's waste transfer company to access their site and dispose of trash. The suspicion opened the door to theories involving an unwanted pregnancy, born from a forbidden relationship between nanny and employer. But those theories ultimately went nowhere. No real evidence of any relationship between Marika and Edmund ever surfaced. That left investigators looking at a Boston resident named Gerald Finch, an odd man known for wandering the streets at all hours of the night. According to what they learned, he was a loner who went out with his dog looking for intoxicated women. But people who knew him said he could never hold a conversation with these women for long, and typically ended up walking home alone. He was eventually ruled out as a suspect after it came out that, on the night Marika was killed, he'd received a speeding ticket in nearby Andover. The following year, he took his own life at home, and although he'd been investigated, nothing ever connected him to the crime. As the years passed, Marika Bergqvist's murder never came close to being solved. Her legs were never found, and likely never will be. The questions that still haunt Boston police center on how she vanished from the middle of the city, and how no one heard an electric saw running that entire weekend. The way the body was disposed of also suggests the killer didn't live near any isolated areas. After all, he felt comfortable enough dumping the remains in a downtown dumpster rather than driving even a short distance to somewhere without witnesses. To investigators, that points to someone local. Someone who, in some strange way, managed to move through the aftermath of Marika Bergqvist's murder and dismemberment completely unnoticed. Some believe that dumping her body in trash bags in a dumpster in the heart of the city wasn't really an attempt to hide her at all, but a statement, a way of showing everyone exactly how he saw women.